what about this whole issue of journalists? You know, Piers Morgan has been one of the big talk show hosts that's constantly says it's a disgrace that Israel doesn't allow journalists in.
First, I think there's the highest number of journalists in any per war zone in Gaza than anywhere else. Right, they're just Gazan journalists, right? And that's obviously playing Israel's interest because every single Gazan journalist is somebody who's been trained by Hamas and picked by Hamas. I think Israel's right, at least until now, not to have allowed journalists in. And I'll tell you why. So people say, you know, Israel says they're scared the journalists will get killed, and journalist organizations say, well, let us take that risk. Well, yes, that's fair enough. But first of all, Israel's going to get the blame. And much, much more importantly than that, you ask any Israeli parent, any mother or father, their 18-year-old kid is about to go into Gaza. They know they may not come out alive, but they trust the army is going to do the best they can to keep them alive. Now imagine this journalist team in Gaza, and don't put any illusion, they are going to be absolutely everywhere, and the war is absolutely everywhere, which means you're going to have people popping out with things, objects that are all just to figure out, is it an RPG from 500 meters away, or is it a camera? Right? The fact that a soldier has to spend 3 seconds radioing in going, do we know if there's any journalists in the area? And a commander goes, I don't know. Let me get a drone over and see. And at that moment, an RPG is fired and that soldier is dead. Which Israeli parent is going to let their kids anywhere near a war zone like that? Now, by the way, in other war zones, it's the same. In Ukraine, do you think the Ukrainian army lets journalists wander around between Russian and Ukrainian positions? Have you seen any journalists doing that? Are you insane? The Ukrainian army will take them in quickly. They can be in a particular area where the commanders know they're there. They're allowed to film on the Ukrainian side very quickly, and then they're sent back. That's what Israel's been doing. And of course, the Hamas will just dress as journalists. I mean, let's not be stupid, right? So, you know, having vans going around with the press on, you now got to figure out, is it a Hamas van or is it, you know, it's an impossible. That's ridiculous.
Okay, everyone, welcome to a really special episode of JTV where we're joined by, to be honest, a rabbi that him and I go back a very long way. And Rabbi Daniel Rowe has featured on JTV on numerous occasions. In fact, I think you spoke at the launch of JTV nearly 10 years ago. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And I know, it's crazy to think that. But now you moved to Israel recently and is working at Aish Global in Jerusalem. He's talking to me right now, literally, I'm assuming, looking out towards the Kotel, the Western Wall, and it's just incredible work that Rabbi Rowe and Aish do. But today we thought it would be a good idea to talk about what we're seeing in the news, what's being shoved down our throats, more, less than just for Jews, but for non-Jews as well, and the narratives they're being told. And given JTV's reach and platform, I feel a duty that to debunk the lies and to share the truth about what's going on. And we're going to talk about what we're seeing right now, what's happening in Gaza, the claims that Hamas are making, that the media are making. But just on a broader point, Rabbi, before we talk about all of that, have you noticed that, because this is something I was saying earlier today on one of the recordings, that I feel like in the past, over the last 10 years or so, whenever you had these skirmishes between Israel and Hamas, the truth was a little bit harder to decipher because we were relying on limited information. Maybe Israel wasn't always as quick to get out the facts. Or maybe just the lives were being better covered up. And I feel like now the lies are becoming clearer, actually. It's becoming easier to when Hamas says Israel hit a hospital and it turns out actually there's nothing of the sort, or there were Hamas terrorists there. Have you noticed that the lies are becoming more exposed now?
Well, I think it very much depends which media circles you operate in. I think the fact that there's a whopping amount of disinformation and a whopping amount of narrativization is so obvious. That's generally true of social media world altogether, even without a war going on here. And the passions and emotions that get raised whenever Israel is involved in anything, pro and against, are gigantic. So yes, in that sense, it's much easier to see that there are these crazy narratives going on. For many people who live inside those spaces, it's actually harder and harder because of the way the human brain works. We are susceptible. We're designed to think in groups. So if you happen to inhabit a left-wing political space, you will be completely bombarded by a particularly vicious narrative at the moment. If you happen to rely on Google or Wikipedia for your searches, you're also going to be bombarded with very selective information, etc. So you occupy a particular space where you're not as bound by those narratives, so you can see straight through things. So I don't know if it's easier or harder. I think we generally live in a more crazily polarized world, and depending on where you inhabit will depend on how easy it is to see through falsehoods or be susceptible to them.
That's such a great answer. On the one hand, the facts are more easily decipherable. I remember just being in school and non-Jewish friends being like, what did Israel do there? What? And it was harder to know exactly what's going on. Whereas now, if you wish to discover the truth, there's more resources available. But the point is, it's also things are becoming more fanatical, more intense. And so emotionally, if you're less invested in Israel's narrative, then it's actually can be harder. Or if you are invested, but you also feel tied towards other political trends or whatever. But let's talk about some of the key accusations, because I think it's so important that we continue to work on shedding light on all these things. The first thing I wanted to talk about is just the general broad criticism that is made about Israel's conduct in this Gaza war. One of the chief critics of Israel on surprisingly the conservative right in America is a guy called Dave Rich, and he's ironically or perhaps fittingly a comedian who's turned into some kind of big commentator on this.
Dave Smith.
Dave Smith. Forgive me. I'm getting.
There's another one who I haven't heard of now.
No. Dave Rich is actually. Thank you for pointing that out. Dave Rich, forgive me, is a very, very prominent writer that talks about anti-Semitism, and he's a great guy. So thank you for pointing that out for that slip. Yeah, Dave Smith. Sorry, Dave Smith. Has basically makes the argument, as do many of the Israel critics, that Israel's just gone way overboard and shows very little concern for human life in Gaza. And one of the arguments he makes is, he said, imagine if in America you had a school that was taken hostage by terrorists, let's say, and then the American police just went in and obliterated the whole thing. Would we consider that proportionate, acceptable? And more than that, they even say if the hostages were being held by, let's say, a terrorist group inside of Israel, would Israel be acting the same way to its own civilians as it is to the people of Gaza? How would you unpack all of that?
A few things. The first is, it's very important, forget the wider audience, to ourselves, to understand one thing. Every death is a tragedy. End of discussion. In that point, and I know you get almost, it becomes cliche to say it, but it's true. Generally speaking, death is tragic, right? If we're going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, but death in war has added dimensions of tragedy, and death where there's no way to avoid it. Let's take the analogy of rescuing hostages. If you accidentally kill hostages or kill anybody who didn't need to be killed, that's tragic. Whether you're to blame or not, it's tragic.
Is the death of Sinwar a tragedy?
I said hostages. I said people who didn't have to die. Yeah. Sorry. I'll correct myself. On some very deep level, no, but I wouldn't say death of a person who's trying to kill you is a tragedy. Maybe tragic they got to that point where that's the best thing that has to happen. Yeah. But no, I'm talking about the tragedy of people who are not actively involved in combat, who are not trying to kill you, that's what I mean. But let's take the analogy, because I think that hostage analogy is an imperfect analogy, but just take it for a moment. So let's imagine, to get the proportions accurate, okay, let's divide everything in Gaza by 1,000. So you got this school somewhere with 2,200 children in it. Let's say that's like, instead of 2.2 million Gazans. In order to have your 40,000 Hamas, there's 40 terrorists amongst them. Now, in order to make it a bit more realistic, maybe a university college is a better example than a school, because it turns out that many of the college people are actually very pro those 40. Many of them want to join them, right? But you're trying to get those 40 terrorists to be killed, and you're trying to save the 2,200, okay? Let's say the police have managed to kill 20 of those 40 terrorists, and at the same time they've killed, or let's say 20, whatever the number is, let's say 20, and at the same time 20 of the students have also been killed, but 2,180 have been saved. You would probably say that's been an amazing police operation. You might want to check, did any of those 20 students who got killed, could they have been saved? But proportionally, you would say the police are doing a wonderful job. And now let's say they've got a few more rooms they've got to clear. So, okay, you'd want them to work very slowly and methodically, but as a proportion, if you've kept 99% of the civilians alive and destroyed half or more of the terrorists, you would say you're doing a pretty decent job. And you want to check every single thing you've done to make sure there was nothing exaggerated. But there's nothing disproportionate about that. And if you then do the numbers in Gaza, you will see that's exactly what's happened. There's been roughly 20,000, I would guess, Hamas fighters killed. And I'm happy to show you why that looks like a very logical figure. About 20,000 roughly civilians who've been killed or died for any reason as a result of the war. And then probably about another 12 to 15,000 civilians who died nothing to do with the war. They just, that's very important, I think, when we talk about numbers in this war as well, because there's so many numbers thrown around. What happens is every day the Gaza Ministry of Information sends out, or the media office sends out numbers to the world's media to pick up. And then every few weeks, the Gaza Health Ministry actually produces, they do, I believe, I know a lot of people attack them, I do think they make a very serious attempt to get accurate numbers, which the Ministry of Information doesn't. And the health ministry tries to list names. It tries to list the breakdown of gender and age. It tries to list their identity numbers. And they have two ways to pick up those numbers. One is directly. So, most people who die go through a hospital or some kind of burial or something. They'll directly verify them. And then in order to make sure they've captured every single person who's died in Gaza, you can also send in a report. And that is open to manipulation. And they used to list exactly how many came from their direct verification, how many came from the wider reporting. They've stopped breaking that down as far as I can tell in the data. So their latest figures towards the end of July were suggested 55,000 names that they have. That's a bit less than the number that the information ministry makes up every day, but it's not a million miles away. So 55,000. Now, it's possible that number is the real number is a few thousand lower than that. Let me tell you what's not possible. All this talk in the Lancet and these other journals of, oh, that's direct deaths. The BBC always says this is the claim, the numbers killed by the IDF since the war started. That is not true. This is the number of human beings who have died in Gaza since the war began. How do we know? First, some of the officials have actually said so explicitly. Others have tried to contradict it, but it's very simple. There is no other death list in Gaza. Every year there's a death list in Gaza of who dies of cancer and who dies of old age and who dies of infant mortality. Here they just put all the lists into one. There's no causes reported. So this is 100% as full a death list as they can possibly get from all causes. Direct military action. Hamas fighters will be in there. Civilians who died as a result of the strikes will be in there. People who died indirectly. In war, there's always a lot of people who die. More people die indirectly because they can't access food or can't access hospitals or something. All the terrible, terrible tragedies of war, they're in there as well. And then people whose death has absolutely nothing to do with the war, right? The people who would have died had there been a war or not been a war are in there as well. So that's anyone who died from cancer and heart disease and old age and infant mortality. So if you want to get a kind of closer to accurate, you would say there's 55,000, maybe a bit less, maybe it's 52,000, but somewhere in that range. You then have to work out how many people die in Gaza every year. And it's amazing journalists don't do this. It is so easy to access. You go to a non-war year like 2022, you calculate the number who've died. I think it's about 6,600 to 6,700, something in that ballpark. And then what you do is you say, okay, fine. So war's been going on 21 months, just divide by 12, it gives you the monthly death rate, multiply by 21. And you'll see that had there been no war, between 11 and 12,000, closer to 12,000 people would have died. So that means what you're looking for is how many people have died because there's been a war. And the answer is 40 to 43,000. Then you try and say, well, how many have died because they're Hamas fighters? And the IDF thinks it's 20 to 25,000. By the way, you can cross-correlate that figure in case people are skeptical. But I'm happy to get back to that in a minute. But
yeah, we should.
Let's assume... Okay, let's just work for a moment, assuming that's correct. Let's say the lower end, let's say it's about 20,000. That means that 20 to 23,000 civilians. So it's about 1-to-1. That's deaths of all causes. Now, we know that the official sort of United Nations figures of deaths in urban war can be 1-to-9. Critics of that figure say, no, that doesn't include, that includes all the indirect deaths. But here we're talking about all the indirect deaths. Right, so we've gone from a normal war figure of 1 to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 down to 1-to-1 in the most difficult urban environment. I mean, it's really, really, really difficult. So now I'm not saying there haven't been individual decisions by IDF soldiers or commanders or even instructions that might be morally wrong. It's possible there have been. And I do think after the war, like the IDF's done with every other war. It's going to have to be a very, very thorough investigation. I think they should have non-Israeli monitors who can verify that the process is being done very thoroughly. Whether they should, because why does Israel have to keep justifying itself? Okay, I think the world will need it, and I think it'll be good for Israel to make sure that there's no possible squeaking or anything. 100% transparent. And I know there's a lot of investigations already undergoing. They have to make that a fully transparent process. But when you zoom out and look at the big picture, let's put it slightly differently. So 20,000 civilians have died roughly as a result of the war, directly, indirectly, whether by Israel, also including the numbers who died because of Hamas's actions. Every person who's died who's a civilian adds up to about 20, maybe 23,000. That's 1% of the population. That means that 99% of the population that was in Gaza and alive when the war began is still alive now. That's huge, right? That's very, very rare in war.
In 1948, the world witnessed the rebirth of the Jewish state, the State of Israel. A moment celebrated as a miracle of survival and self-determination after centuries of persecution and the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet for decades, this event has been twisted into a narrative of theft and catastrophe, with the so-called Nakba portrayed as Israel's original sin, where Jews allegedly stole Arab land and displaced innocents in a premeditated act of ethnic cleansing. But what if this story is fundamentally inverted? What if the cause and effect are the other way around? Not Israel aggressively seizing territory and Arabs responding in self-defense, but Arabs, driven by deep-seated hatred, rejecting the Jews' legal and historical rights to live in their ancestral homeland and waging a genocidal war long before Israel's re-establishment. In this JTV Plus documentary, we're going to uncover the unvarnished truth about 1948, the centuries of pogroms and anti-Semitic violence that set the stage, the Arab leaders' explicit calls for extermination, and the defensive war Israel fought to secure its existence. We'll challenge the pervasive lies head-on, showing how Arab rejection of peace wasn't about creating a Palestinian state, but about denying Jews the right to live at all. From the Nazi-allied leader of the Arabs in Palestine, the Mufti al-Husseini, to the forgotten occupations by Jordan and Egypt, when no Palestinian state was even considered, this is the story of a conflict rooted not in displacement, but in whether the Jews deserve to live in their homeland. Join us as we debunk the myths with facts, confront the historical record fairly but firmly, and reveal why 1948 was not an act of aggression, but a righteous response to annihilation. This is what really happened in 1948. To watch this JTV Plus documentary and access much more premium content, click on the link in the video description.
In war, you're usually able to get civilians completely out of the war zone, miles away. Okay, in this war, Egypt didn't let them out, the world didn't let them out, so Israel stuck with them inside. Civilians inside war zones have very, very low survivability rates. Here, 99% of the civilians are alive. That's really important to understand that. So going back to the analogy of a hostage rescue, it's like you went into a campus of 2,200 people, including 40 terrorists, and now let's make it who are busy attacking you, firing rockets and mortars and guns at you. So you can't just stay besieging them. They're killing civilians on your side. Your police have gone in. So far, they've managed to kill at least 20 of the terrorists. Unfortunately, 20 of the civilians have died, but you've managed to keep nearly 2,200 of those civilians alive. That's a huge feat. And, emotionally, you can connect to death more easily than you can connect to a life, because you can see a dead body and it arouses, quite rightly, upset and anger and all these emotional feelings. And you have to ask the question, could that person have been saved? It's very hard to say, well, look at the 2,200 who are alive. Look at the 2.2 million who are alive. It's, you go, oh, that's a good picture. But that is a huge achievement. That's, again, using Dave Smith's analogy, that would be an enormous achievement in a hostage rescue environment to get 99% of the hostages out of there. In this case, 99% of the civilians alive. Sorry, that's quite long, but I hope that answers.
It does. It is huge. And, you sort of say, well, I can understand why people focus on the deaths, but maybe we don't want to go down this rabbit hole now, but they don't do this with other conflicts where there's
That's
much
true.
higher
That's
combatant
true.
to non-combatant ratios, right?
That's true. Yeah, well, the best example, the closest analogy to this war. I mean, you raised the question before. What would Israel do if it was its own civilians holding its own civilians hostage? But we know the answer to that. We've actually seen it in a recent war. It's Iraq. The most recent war that happened, similar to this, not the whole toppling Saddam Hussein. That's a whole disaster in itself. I'm
Yeah.
talking about when ISIS rose up, and ISIS was, took over huge parts of Iraq, huge parts of Syria, and it took years for a coalition basically led by America and Britain and NATO countries, who were mainly using air power and special forces and command and control and intelligence. And then the Iraqi army was actually on the ground doing the fighting. But the morality that was being led by, it's clear neither the Iraqi army nor the Americans nor the British wanted any dead civilians. Everybody wanted to keep all the live. British and American Air Force used very precise targeting. The intelligence was as precise as they could possibly get it in a situation quite similar to Gaza, except much easier than Gaza. There were a lot less ISIS fighters per city and per civilian than in Gaza. The ISIS fighters only had about 2 or 3 years to prepare, not 17 years. They didn't have the mass support of the population. They hadn't dug anywhere near as many tunnels, etc., etc. They didn't nowhere near as well funded. So let's take one major battle, Mosul, right, 2017. It took 2 years, which so far is longer than Gaza. Gaza may get to 2 years, but it took 2 years. There were a maximum of 4,000 ISIS fighters in there, something less, but I think 4,000 is a reasonable estimate. The civilian population, long before the war started, had been 2.2 million, but most of them evacuated. So by the time the Iraqi army and the American and British and all the forces are there, there's only 400,000 civilians. Okay, 400,000 civilians, 4,000 ISIS fighters. Nobody knows to this day what the death toll was. We know that the whole town was destroyed. Over 70% of the buildings were completely destroyed because the way ISIS fights, like Hamas, in tunnels, in hospitals, in schools, under buildings, everywhere. Every building is booby-trapped. There's explosives everywhere. By the time you've each finished fighting each other, the buildings are totally destroyed, right? So clearly the Iraqis, the American, the British, they're trying their best to keep all the civilians as safe as they possibly can. Now, according to at one point they said they don't think there's any dead civilians. Then they realized, no, I think they're talking about 6,000 to 10,000. But that's direct killed, meaning killed by direct airstrikes from the British and the Americans, which is a huge number. But how about the total deaths? Every civilian caught in the crossfire, every civilian who died as a result of the war in one way or another. So the only figure we have for it's the Kurdish intelligence. They were actually on the ground going through the whole town. And it was published, I think, in The Independent, ran an article 2017. Quite a few newspapers ran it. It's 40,000 dead civilians. Or, well, 4,000 that will be ISIS fighters, so 36,000 dead civilians for 4,000 ISIS fighters. From an army saving its own civilians, an army backed by Western intelligence, Western air power, Western ethics, and its own desire to keep its civilians safe. And there were 9 civilians killed or who died for all causes for every ISIS fighter killed. There were almost double the number of civilian deaths as in Gaza, and only a fifth the number of terrorists killed as in Gaza. So when you compare it, you realize what Israel's managed to achieve in Gaza, again, not saying every single action, but what Israel's managed to achieve in the big picture is incredible.
Yeah.
The amount of lives, the amount of civilians and hostile civilians is kept alive is unprecedented. The amount, the ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths is way lower than anything remotely parallel on Earth. And on the contrary, I think militaries are going to come to Israel in future years. They won't announce it because of all the crazy anti-Israel stuff. But of course, NATO is going to learn, had we been able to do what Israel did in Mosul, we might have been able to save another 32,000 civilians. We could have saved 80 or 90% of civilians died. So when you put it in the big picture, it shows you what's really going on here. And by the way, statistics, people complain they don't include emotions. It's true. But if you want to understand the ethics of what's going on and the morality, you do have to sometimes zoom out and look at the statistics and look, because they tell you the full story. An individual picture doesn't tell you the story.
It's just so I was watching a conversation with Jordan Peterson and I guess it was the chair of the Oxford Union. And I mean, Piers Morgan does as well. Or Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, they keep saying, there's been 50,000 people have been killed in this war. It's like, do you not want to tell us how many of those are Hamas? Do you not want to tell us the context that civilians die in war and that is actually an incredible achievement?
Yeah, that's right, and exactly when you look at it, it's not 50,000. That's the point I keep making. That's the mistake. And by the way, the media, all the media I've seen do this, even sometimes it does. They literally report and say 50,000 killed by Israel in the war. That's not true. That's the number who have died since the war began. Now, it is trickier to say 55,000 have died in Gaza. That indicates that around 43,000 to 40,000 have died because of the war. Okay, but it's still sloppy journalism to say killed in a war. That's really incorrect. So, like I say, the correct number, assuming that there's no exaggerated numbers in there, which there probably are, 2 to 3,000, but let's say it's pretty right. I think the Gaza Ministry of Health, not the Ministry of Information, the Ministry of Health really does make an effort to get accurate figures. And therefore, I think we're looking at something like at least 20,000 Hamas fighters, at most 23,000 civilians.
And you touched before on how we can know whether IDF claims about how many of those killed are Hamas terrorists, how we can verify that. Would you like to expound a bit on that?
Well, there's a few things. One is your opening statement. You actually said we can access to all the information. One of the frustrating things in this war is we don't, because Israel's not giving access to all the information because Israel doesn't have all the information. Right? If you actually speak to people close to the government or close to the military, as I've tried to, I'm not that well connected myself. In Israel, you do bump into people. So what they really say is they don't want to give figures that will turn out to be false. So they know how many civilians have died directly. They don't even have a 100% accurate count of the Hamas, although they're better estimating that because they can try to analyze individual battles. They haven't yet been through all the camera footage of the whole war and so on. Okay, right. So we don't have exact numbers on them, but a few things. One, that is because of their integrity, right? Generally speaking, just like Hamas, generally speaking, throw out numbers during a war that turn out to be all wrong. The Gaza Ministry of Health generally throws out numbers that tend to be pretty accurate, only maximum 10% inaccurate. The IDF tends to have numbers that are pretty accurate as well. That's the first thing. The second thing is at several points in the war, the numbers have been corroborated. So, for example, right at the beginning of 2024, I think at the time Israel was talking about 9,000, it had killed 9,000 Hamas fighters or something. And then this Hamas guy goes on and accidentally slips that at least 6,000 of their fighters have been killed. Right now, you have to remember in Gaza, Hamas only 75% of the forces they control. So that means they were really claiming 8,000 people have been killed, and they always underestimate. So it's pretty decent corroboration of the IDS figure. There was another point when Israel was talking about, I think, having killed 15 or 16,000 Hamas fighters, and an American intelligence report came out and said they thought 40% of Hamas had been killed, which is the same figure. So there have been quite a few corroborations, but the best way to corroborate is just go into the information that the Gaza Ministry of Health has put out, and they put out ages. And you can break it down. If a journalist was willing to not be lazy and actually look at the numbers and take the types of groups where you have people of fighting age, teenagers and adult men, but not elderly, and look at the difference between the number of men and the number of women, and it's gigantic, both in men and in teenagers. The gap is huge. And if you count the male over female gap, it's 20,000 people. So that already shows you that, I mean, that's pretty likely. Actually, it's probably higher than that, because at the very beginning of the war, the IDF was targeting the Hamas commanders and the Nukhba units in their homes, or as they were coming, had drones over their homes. They were watching them come up, and they were hitting them ways, and unfortunately, civilians died in that. But most civilians were family members, which that doesn't make it okay. The direct question is, are you legally and morally able to target them, knowing there might be civilian death? But the point is that there were very few other adult men in those homes, which means that during that targeting, almost every adult male being killed was a Hamas fighter. And so you're actually going to have you're going to have more than just an excess numbers. That's a complicated point. It probably means if you're doing the estimate to your best of your ability, it's likely between 20 to 23,000 actually Hamas fighters, like the IDF is saying. So that's a very high corroboration of those figures.
And what about... Do Hamas fighters that are 16 or 17, let's say, are they classed as Hamas? Are they classed as children?
Oh, so in Gaza, you've got a unique feature, which is they report everyone under 18, and sometimes they even fiddle that one as children. I don't think in most conflict zones in the world, that's how you report children. So that's a ridiculous figure. Again, people throw out numbers like 20,000 children. The Hamas Gaza Ministry of Health, I think, has the number more like 17,000. When you pull teenagers out, that's like half those figures. Now, again, of course, that still includes civilians, right? But when you factor in again the difference in men and women, it's almost double the number of teenage boys than girls.
Yeah.
Yes, a 17-year-old with a gun and an RPG or firing a rocket is 100% a killer and a combatant. It doesn't matter if they're 15 years old. If they're carrying a Kalashnikov and they're shooting at you and they're carrying an RPG and they're blowing things up, or they're carrying explosives and running up to your position, then they are 100% a terrorist. By the way, even if they're a spotter and they just run up to your position to determine where you are, and they're just then calling in somebody else to fire a mortar at you, of course they're still a combatant. So again, I don't want to be callous about any of this stuff. And also I'll tell you something else weird. This is not my job. This really isn't. I care deeply about the morality of it as a rabbi and also somebody involved in dialogue with Palestinians and with Muslims and so on. And I do care a lot about this stuff. So I also want to look at it myself and see what I think about all this. But any journalist could have done this job. And I've looked around and journalists have been, I don't know what do we pay journalists for nowadays. If they just repeat everything the Gaza Ministry of Information says every day, then what are they doing in their job? There's really minimal fact checking needed to ascertain everything I've just said. And if a journalist watching this says, I could do a better job and he's got the numbers wrong, you're the professional, not me. This is ridiculous that journalists are not reporting that 99% of the civilians are alive, right? The journalists are not reporting the combatant civilian ratio is about 1-to-1. These are obvious things any journalist can fact check. They're so
what do you put
easy
that down
to check.
to?
I think there's some of it is malice. I mean, not malicious. Well, there is the three groups. You got your Al Jazeera malice. They exist and they were created, by the way, to attack the West and particularly to attack Israel. Then you've got groupthink. Most people who work in journalists, let's say New York Times, BBC, are very politically left wing. So imagine you're asking Jeremy Corbyn and people like him, right, to be your journalist. Even if they try to be neutral, they're bought into a narrative that Israel's the aggressive monster. And even a human trying their best to be neutral and fair, just like we're not neutral or fair, they're not neutral and fair. Nobody's really neutral and fair when it comes to Israel. Very hard to find neutral and fair people, right? That's why you got to try and work with facts. So they're not going to put the effort in to look at this stuff because the worst case to think is it would mislead the public in, the story has to be, it's terrible and we've got to stop this war, right? That's the majority of journalists in the world that belong to the political hard left. They've got this narrative, they've got this story going on. If they're trying to be neutral, they won't be. That doesn't absolve them of guilt in this, because the fact is they're still responsible as journalists to kick their political views as far as they can. Okay. And the final group, I think, are just lazy journalists, quite frankly. Because there are people who are not anti-Israel in the journalist community who could do this fact checking very, very easily. And they've also not done it. So, I don't know. For the last group, I don't accuse them all of being lazy. That's not fair. I think just when something's repeated often enough, it just becomes part of your instinct to report it, and you kind of say, well, they don't distinguish between fighters. What they usually do is put a line saying they don't distinguish between fighters and civilians, and some have doubted their credibility, something like that as the caveats, which is fair enough. It's something. What I'm saying is very, very easy to fact check, and no good reason why journalists haven't done it in significant numbers.
I think it's also a bit of a phenomenon of the emperor's got no clothes. People are just scared they're just scared to state these obvious truths because they're worried about the blowback. What are your thoughts on all these recent claims we've seen about starvation, Israel pushing back, saying there's lots of disinformation, and just more generally about where all the moral responsibility lies?
It's a very, very difficult question. Again, getting facts is almost impossible. I think one thing we can ascertain, there was this, I'm not sure Israel did the right thing. In fact, I think it was a mistake when they announced several weeks of not sending food in, even though they knew there were months and months and months of food in Gaza. I think they have to be aware of the world they're operating in. If they've got a plan to find an alternative food supply system, so put that plan in place. And so, okay, but I do understand it. They saw it was what was keeping Hamas in power. They knew there was enough food in the strip. Fine. I think the rollout of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation at the beginning was not good. I think all the numbers about how many people being shot there was almost no doubt incredibly ridiculous exaggerations. But nevertheless, there was definitely some things went wrong in the beginning there. Now what's happening, though, is under massive pressure, Israel then said, okay, they leave the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to run southern Gaza and the areas they control, and they're leaving the UN to run northern Gaza and areas Hamas controls. And I don't know what happened with the UN, whether they're just completely incompetent, whether they went on strike for some reason. I mean, one of the things we have to be aware of is the United Nations in Gaza does not run lots of independent people from around the world. 30,000 employees, all but 300 are local Gazans. And you don't get a work permit in Gaza to go and work for the UN unless Hamas agrees to let you work for the UN. So we're talking about Hamas allies, 30,000 of them, running the United Nations. If Hamas says we need a crisis, so limit the amount of things coming in, or tell us where every truck's coming so we can steal it, that's what happens. And now Israel's trying to work with the world and coordinate these airdrops until they can get enough food in there, circumvent the UN system. And that's what's going on. So in terms of how much food per person there is in Gaza, from what I understand, there's more than enough for every Gazan to be having healthy meals per day. That seems to be, people are calculating these numbers. I don't know. I don't do all this calculation myself. Again, these are things relatively easy to fact check. You just look at the numbers being airdropped in. You look at the numbers being sent through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which by now, in a short span of, 2 months, has done like 115 million meals.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge amount. Which means effectively they're looking after probably about half the Gazan population, right? If you just do the calculation, they're probably feeding about 1 million people the daily calorie intake per day, as the other million that were supposed to be under UN, that is disastrous. Having said all that, yes, perhaps I'm not an international law expert. I suspect in international law Israel's doing much more than it needs to. But I think also, and this is a very important point, apart from the intensity of world scrutiny, right, which is one thing, you're right, no other conflict gets. In fact, I've often said to people, including journalists, how many other wars are going on in the world right now? And most people have no clue. And it's about 31, 32 other wars, right? Many of which have far more casualties than this one, right? But it's like the world doesn't, it's like Israel's boom, cameras on, action. The whole world's just got to obsess about this. Okay. But leave aside world obsession, which you do have to factor in, by the way, is our own internal compass. We did not come back to the land of Israel to be like everybody else. So the fact the world holds us the double standard may be ridiculous and unfair, but we've got to hold ourselves to a very high standard too. We've got to be able to justify ourselves before the creator of the universe if we're religious, right? And I think that as religious people, that's got to be our standard. Can we say to Hashem, we did all we could, right? These are your creations. These are your living beings, just like according to many opinions in Halakha and Jewish law, we don't say Hallel on the last 6 days of Pesach, Passover. We don't say the normal song of praise when we get saved because the Egyptians drowned in the sea. And even though we do praise God, we say half Hallel, we can't say the full Hallel. Why? These were enemies coming to kill us. But the fact is, my handiwork, says God, are drowning in the sea, and you're singing songs. Now, you should know there's a big debate about this, both in the ancient rabbinic texts in the Talmud and Midrashim, and also running through the medieval commentators. When you look at the actual way the Shulchan Aruch brings it, the Jewish law brings it, that is one of the two reasons we don't, which means that we embed within us a consciousness that we've got to understand that sometimes you can both be defending yourself against the killer, and still you'd rather there were less deaths. Right? Okay. So for that reason, I do think Israel has a duty beyond that which normal nations have to try to do what it can to make sure there's as many lives can be kept alive in Gaza. I think overall it's done an unbelievable job in an impossible situation. And I do think now trying with the airdrops with global help, that's a big step. I think, I'm not a military planner. I don't know what military possibilities there are. But I would hope there's a lot of thought, and I believe there's a lot of thought going into how can they now, they've announced they want to make the final push into the Hamas strongholds. Obviously, there's a lot of debates about it. But if they can get the civilians out of there and get them into zones and filter people so that no Hamas fighters can move through. And again, it's easier said than done, I'm sure. No weapons are transferred through. And even if it takes a long time, let it take a long time and make sure they get to places where they can be fed. I would say more than that. Start running a new administration already. If somebody in Gaza is willing to take over with support from Arab states or whatever, start running a new administration in the zones that Israel's already conquered. I think that's what they should do. Again, I'm not a military person. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know what all the conversations behind the scenes. But to me, that would make a lot of sense. You take the territories you've already got in control. Are there people you can trust to be in charge? Could the United Arab Emirates get involved, or United States or someone, and start putting the kids back into schools? Take all the sick curriculum about how it's your obligation to kill Jews out. Don't let preachers into the mosques who believe in the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. They're here to finish Hitler's job, all that kind of stuff. but really get back into, what the United Arab Emirates managed to do, what Saudi Arabia managed to do, creating a healthy Islamic society. And in Gaza, it may take a lot longer because there's a war and trauma, and the hatred of Israel will probably be there for a long time, but you can start to create a new life. Anyway, the point is, get them to a place where they can be fed safely, where they can start to have hope. But I think, broadly speaking, back to answer your question, from what I understand, Israel's doing much more, doing everything it possibly can, more than anyone else would do. That doesn't absolve us from always thinking, can we do more and more and more, right? We want to get to a situation where we can say at the end of this war that really we kept 2.2 million civilians alive, and there wasn't more we could have done. That's what we'd like to get to.
Mm. It's interesting, the whole thing about, not the angels being told not to sing and praise to God because the Egyptians are drowning. I thought about that.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, on the other hand, the Jews do sing. It's a difference between what goes on in heaven and what happens down on earth. And what?
Yes, that's one of the standard answers.
Yeah.
We sing because we got saved, and the angels can't sing because. But the Shiltei Gibborim, again, most of your audiences won't know these authorities are major medieval authorities, and in fact, I think it's Yalkut Ruvenu, Yalkut Shimoni, one of the classical ancient midrashim actually says, no, even we don't say a full Hallel for that reason. There's two reasons brought down in Jewish law. And yes, we thank Hashem and praise Hashem, but we also have a limitation on it. Again, that's a debate, right? So, but the fact that it's even there, and the fact that it is brought down as one of the two reasons in Jewish law, shows you how far this principle goes. So we definitely thank Hashem that he saves us, no question. Just like we thank Hashem for the removal of the threats of the Hezbollah fighters. And yes, when Nasrallah and Sinwar are removed from the world, we thank God that there's a major threat removed, and a pure evil removed. When we hear the Iranian nuclear program is destroyed, we thank Hashem for that too. Thank God for that too. And when we hear that Hamas units and divisions are being destroyed, again, we thank God that we're safer. We thank God this unit that was planning to eventually kill 8 million Jews no longer has the ability to do so. But we also feel that it's a shame we got to a situation where that's what has to happen. And certainly when it comes to civilians, and yes, you can argue many of the civilians were supporters of all this. Okay, but they're not physically in a position to harm us. And that means that for us, our obligation is to keep as many alive as we possibly can. And again, looking back on it, Israel's ability to keep 99% of the civilians alive is staggering. It's incredible. Yeah. And after the war, we should check there weren't any that, we messed up on.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because when I think about the singing of praise to God, like when the Egyptians drowned, like it wasn't appropriate in heaven. And it's not appropriate to do a full Hallel in the future when we look back on it because of what happened. But at the time, we did sing a full praise. And so I only say it just because I sometimes wonder, yes, we've shown extraordinary concern for the lives of our enemy population. And yes, I agree we should hold ourselves to a higher standard. I guess what I've been grappling with over the last 2 years is, actually, do we have too much of that? Not just, we should do that and we got to do more. Is Israel, one of its potential Achilles heels since its reestablishment, really, has there maybe been too much of holding ourselves to a higher standard in a way that maybe you could argue Torah might teach us to be a bit more, forthright, in the same way that, we get this lesson about if you're kind to the cruel, you'll end up being cruel to the kind. One thing that I think of in particular that I really grapple with is the fact that we've had 1,000 soldiers that have been killed on the altar of this very point about being so surgically precise for the other side. And I do wonder, from a Torah perspective, have we got the balance right here? And I think maybe the context, that the fact that the civilian population largely support Hamas isn't entirely irrelevant. Given that Hamas are the initial aggressors here, and it's something that I do struggle with.
That's a different question. Okay, that I agree with you. There's a huge moral dilemma around that. Of the 1,000 soldiers who died since October 7th, about 400 or more have died inside Gaza since October 7th, right? And that's a really, really, really difficult question, operationally. Certainly, I think when it comes to sending a soldier into a house you now know is empty or definitely has no civilians in, or blowing the house up when you know there could easily be explosives in there, I definitely see, even though the optics are terrible, and even though everyone's saying you destroyed 70% of the buildings, you destroy the building. You don't send soldiers in to risk their lives, right? Once you know the civilians are out, you don't send soldiers in. I think, at the beginning of the war, when they could go house to house, that was one thing. Once Hamas started putting explosives, and very sophisticated ones, into every single building and every single room, and there's a real soldier really getting killed going into these buildings, don't go into the building. Make sure civilians are out, blow the building up. I think that's for sure the right thing to do. You don't risk your own people. But I was talking about something else before, which is making sure the food gets in there, making sure when you're bombing, you have the right targeting information and all those sorts of things, which I think Israel, broadly speaking, are doing an incredible job of. And I do think, again, afterwards, double check. Is separate from the ethical question of your own soldier. And there's another huge ethical question in this war, which no one has a great answer to. And it's not even 100% clear in Jewish law what the answer is exactly, which is hostages versus the whole state of Israel. One of the great divisions now in Israeli society is, should we, do a hostage deal, or should we carry on the war? Even though, because these two aims of removing Hamas and getting all the hostages back alive, they're not completely incompatible, but they are points where the more you try to push for one, you can't maximally push for both. For somebody, you're going to have to make decisions, because the price of getting the last 20 back, and this is very important, I think people don't realize this, they're like, well, why can't Israel just do a deal? This politician said you should do a deal. This military guy said you should do a deal. And the answer is, what is a deal with Hamas right now?
Yeah.
A deal with Hamas right now, from what I understand, again, people with intelligence or have been involved in the negotiations might have a different view, but from what I've understood so far, is the deal would be a 60-day deal, where Hamas would say, we'll give the first wave at the beginning of the 60 days. We'll promise to give the second wave on two conditions. Number one is that we come up with a number before the end of the 60 days. And number two is this massive international pressure and guarantees put on Israel that it won't carry on the war if the 60 days passes without a deal, which basically means that at that point, let's suppose that really happens. Suppose there was some, I don't know how they do it, some American guarantees, some UN resolutions putting embargoes on Israel if they do, I don't know what. At that point, how's Israel going to negotiate to get its last 20 people back, last 10 people back? Hamas will just dictate the terms and Israel can't do anything, which basically means this is what will happen. Hamas will be in complete charge of Gaza. Israel will have to agree to be militarily restrained for 4.5 years. By the way, why do Hamas keep going for the 4.5 years number? Because according
Trump,
to
maybe?
No, nothing to do with Trump, because their scholars have ruled that they're allowed to have a break in the war with Israel for a maximum of 5 years. They are never allowed to end the war with Israel until Israel is destroyed. They sometimes use the word until a Palestinian state is established, by which they mean across the whole borders from the river to the sea, it's under Muslim control. They believe, their interpretation of Muhammad's Hudna that he made when he withdrew, they interpret that, although a lot of other Muslims disagree, but the way they interpret it is that you're allowed to pause the war with Israel for less than 5 years to rearm so that you can fight again, only if it's to your advantage. But you're never allowed to pause for more than 5 years. There's a minority of Hamas scholars on the Shura Council who say 10 years, but the majority say 5 years, and that's why they've never, ever, ever had a 5-year period without launching a war. So let's go back again. They would be negotiating for complete control of Gaza, complete control of $80 billion of aid. By the way, they agree, this is their concession, that a bunch of technocrats who are not them can actually technically run Gaza. But if you're the only armed people in Gaza, those technocrats are just responding to you. You rule Gaza. Sure. You decide where the $80 billion of aid, how they're going to build, that's an army. Put it this way, their current tunnel network is assumed to have cost $1 billion. So assume 80 times that weaponry. 9,000 prisoners freed in the West Bank, which includes all their commanders of the West Bank, which basically means they have enough manpower, resurrection of dead terrorist networks to completely take control of the West Bank. So basically the price for getting the last 20 back is Hamas rules the West Bank, Hamas rules Gaza, Israel cannot touch them until they're ready to come to the next war with Israel. And they have $80 billion to decide how to spend it in the interim, plus anything else Qatar and Iran can pour in and Turkey can send their way, right? I mean, that basically is saying in 5 years' time, Israel's going to have bigger than Hamas and Hezbollah and everything, ready to charge into Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and slaughter the population. So that's the price for getting the last, for not going into Gaza now. Now that there are some Israelis who think, okay, we'll get ourselves ready in those 5 years. Let's make the deal now. Let's deal with them in 5 years' time. But you have to understand, whenever you see these surveys and polls in Israel that say things like, most Israelis want to make a deal. That's true. Most Israelis are definitely willing to make a deal. Most Israelis are willing to end the war and get the hostages back, but not if it means they control the West Bank and Gaza and $80 billion of aid, and the IDF could do nothing for the next 5 years, right? That, I don't think most Israelis agree.
Yeah.
So Israel got a really, really difficult dilemma right now.
Yeah. Obviously, we're not going to do anything to get a hostage deal. Like we're not going to sell the country down the river and risk destroying Israel. So, surely everyone can acknowledge that. And
it's difficult because you see a lot of people in Israel's left feel a few things. First of all, they feel that in the end, Israel's going to have to agree to something like that anyway, because you can't, you're not really going to get them out the other way. And some of them feel that we have more of a duty to those 20 who could be identified, who we let down October 7th. Some of them will say, we will find ways to stop Hamas before then. Some of them will say, okay, let's spend 5 years preparing. And just like we did with Iran or with Hezbollah, we'll be ready next time. There's different attitudes. I'm not, and others believe, there's also such internal division, very sadly, that many are willing to believe on both the right and left that the other side is not motivated out of interest to Israel. And I think both of those are wrong. I think both the right wing and the left wing, whether we think they're crazy or right or good or bad, I do believe all politicians of the world are motivated to do good, and they're motivated by their ego, right? For sure. But I
do like believe that famous Dennis Prager line. He says, I'm not really interested in what people's intentions are. You can be very well intentioned and do the most terrible destruction. So, intentions, I guess it's good to hold intentions in people's hearts, because it's important just for societal cohesion and just remembering that we're all debating for the sake of heaven or whatever, for the sake of what's right. But then again, I've just been reading I think it's Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Someone gave it to me recently. It's quite just an interesting side read, and he was saying how even some of the greatest murderers and criminals in history were, when having their sort of final moments of confession or conversation, like genuinely believed that they were doing the right thing, or it's understandable. And so we can convince ourselves of these things.
The reason I said that is that what I was saying is very sad, is you got a lot of people in Israel think, oh, Netanyahu's only doing this to keep his own power or something. Lapid is only saying what he's saying to get his power. I think, of course, the egos are all over the place. And of course, every politician believes the best national interest is them being in power. But I really, really understand the two sides. I'm not saying which right, but they're very, very difficult dilemmas. What I'm saying is when people just say, well, why don't they do a hostage deal? The answer at the moment is this is the price. Now, it could be that as Hamas feel they're going to prioritize destroying us over the hostages, then they may turn around and go, oh, well, in that case, the price of the hostages has gone down quite a lot. Let's see what we can still salvage, right? That's probably the best case scenario, that if they see that Israel's serious about really pushing in and toppling them completely, then hopefully at some point they'll turn around and go, look, we're going to die anyway. Let's get the best deal we can.
Peace through strength. What about this whole issue of journalists? Piers Morgan has been one of the big talk show hosts that's constantly says it's a disgrace that Israel doesn't allow journalists in. From what I read recently, actually, it looks like that might be changing a little bit. But how have you understood this whole issue and this accusation leveled at Israel?
So first, I think there's the highest number of journalists in any per war zone in Gaza than anywhere else. Right, they're just Gazan journalists, right? And that's obviously playing Israel's interest, because every single Gazan journalist is somebody who's been trained by Hamas and picked by Hamas, and therefore they're effectively Hamas spokespeople. That said, I think Israel's right, at least until now, not to have allowed journalists in, and I'll tell you why. So people say, Israel says they're scared the journalists will get killed, and journalist organizations say, well, let us take that risk. Well, yes, that's fair enough. But first of all, Israel's going to get the blame. And much, much more importantly than that, you ask any Israeli parent, any mother or father, their 18-year-old kid is about to go into Gaza. They know they may not come out alive, but they trust the army is going to do the best they can to keep them alive. Now imagine this journalist team in Gaza, and don't put any illusion. They are going to be absolutely everywhere, and the war is absolutely everywhere, which means you're going to have people popping out with things, objects that are all just to figure out, is it an RPG from 500 meters away, or is it a camera, right? The fact that a soldier has to spend 3 seconds radioing in going, do we know if there's any journalists in the area? And a commander goes, I don't know. Let me get a drone over and see. And at that moment, an RPG is fired and that soldier is dead. Which Israeli parent is going to let their kids anywhere near a war zone like that? Now, by the way, in other war zones, it's the same. In Ukraine, do you think the Ukrainian army lets journalists wander around between Russian and Ukrainian positions? Have you seen any journalists doing that? Are you insane? The Ukrainian army will take them in quickly. They can be in a particular area where the commanders know they're there. They're allowed to film on the Ukrainian side very quickly, and then they're sent back. That's what Israel's been doing. I think the demand for journalists, I understand why people want it. By the way, I don't think journalists will be much more objective. They'll come with their narratives. And those that are pro-Israel will interview Gazans who say we hate Hamas and there's plenty of food. And those who are anti-Israel will find the Gazans who say we hate Israel and they're killing us all. So I'm not sure we'll change the story much. But we want for transparency's sake, etc. But which Israeli parent is going to agree to let their kids sit and risk their lives in Gaza, having to figure out every minute whether there's a journalist there or not? And there'll be new orders came in because yesterday they bombed a position and it turned out it was a BBC journalist and the world's gone ballistic and now they can't fire a mortar and they're up Hamas with something that looks like a camera and blows at those soldiers. So I'm sorry, it could be now, again, if there's more and more zones that are safer, then letting journalists in makes sense. Of course, you want to have maximum transparency and so on. But till now in the war, and certainly where there's active war zones, crazy. And it doesn't matter how much the world screams. Like you said before, no one should endanger these young soldiers who are going in there have an impossible enough task as it is, right, than to make it 100 times harder.
Completely agree with that. It's pretty inhumane the way that Israel is sometimes expected to fight this war, and what we put our own soldiers through, and their well-being, should absolutely be prioritized. And I just completely agree with that. I also understand that Israel does sometimes do missions where they'll bring in journalists to let them see as much as they can be exposed to within, safety, reasonable limits.
The internet's full of stuff like this. I reckon Israel sent more journalists in than Ukraine has. I might be wrong. It's possible not. Someone could probably check that one out. Certainly more than most armies do inside active war zones. You don't let journalists roam around in an active war zone. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's lots of war zones. Maybe in Ukraine and Russia, there's loads of journalists running around between the two sides. I doubt that's true. I would think it's crazy if it is. And certainly in Gaza, where your whole issue is not organized, not people fighting in uniforms, but literally people popping up out with RPGs everywhere. And an RPG from 200 meters away looks like no different to a camera from 200 meters. Something on your shoulder, you carry out, you put it, a guy with a helmet. And of course, the Hamas will just dress as journalists. I mean, let's not be stupid, right? So having vans going around with the press on, you now got to figure out, is it a Hamas van or is it, it's an impossible. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Just lastly, on the whole topic of the Gaza war, do you think that any of the international frustration with Israel, let's say the length of the war, issues of like occupation, and what there needs to be some kind of long-term resolution, all these things, do you think any of it, or a good chunk of it, is legitimate? Or, how much of it do you put down to sinister? How much of it do you put down to ignorant? And do you think there's some pause for thought that Israel should have about whether some of it is legitimate or not? And I'm not in no way spinning this in a yes or no way when I ask you this. It's just getting your perspective.
So the vast majority of what I said so far, I'm very comfortable with, has been about as factual and objective as I can give it. Now we move, some of it's been subjective too, and now we definitely move into the subjective. So I say that with a caveat, because anything I'm going to say is going to annoy, probably already has annoyed people, but at least up till now I could say, well, if I quote a number and you don't like it, fine, numbers hopefully don't lie, you always, but here it's more subjective. My own view is twofold. One is Israel on October 7th was forced to fight a multi-front war. Everyone's familiar, they were fighting in Gaza. The amount of attacks against Israel from the West Bank, which the world kind of hears in the background, there's been a death toll on the West Bank, but the amount over there, the refugee camps were effectively being fully controlled by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Lebanon was a huge front. Syria was a huge front at the time. Iraq was a huge front. There was militias, pro-Iranian militias. Iran was a huge front. The Houthis were a huge front. And then came the media and diplomatic onslaught. And of all the fronts at the time, Israel was underprepared for all of them, but it had spent years preparing for some of them. And probably the one it had spent the least amount of time preparing for was the media and diplomatic front and the digital age. It's woefully underprepared. So one thing is its failure to explain itself to the world is a source of frustration. And pros are people all over the world pulling their hair out, like, how long does it take to get information from the government? Sometimes an accusation can be rolling today and it could take days or even occasionally months to get answers. So that's one issue. I also think that Israel suffers from, it's a state under massive stress and pressure. No state in the world's going to deal with the pressure, but Israelis like to talk very loudly and aggressively and strongly quite often. And both on the, if you want to call it the far right and the far left, people talk too much, too strongly, and say wrong things on both sides. The far left using ridiculous language to describe the war when they're trying to attack Bibi, which the whole world then, anti-Israel would just recycle it. See, your own people said it. Okay, Israelis talk that way, but they got to be responsible. And the far right, I think, has been irresponsible too. I think some of the aims that some of the far right would like to have are completely inappropriate. Whether I don't think they're morally defensible, but I could have that debate separately. I'm sure some of you viewers think they are. But at the very least, you got to also function, even if you disagreed with me on the moral front. And I have a whole different approach to how one can eventually make peace with the Muslim world. It's not simple, but I think it is doable. That's another whole discussion. But I think you got to be realistic anyway, right? And all these people people come up with the most crazy ideas. So I think there's legitimate, and now one more thing. Netanyahu made very clear the war aims at the beginning, but there were whole periods of months when he let other people announce what they thought the war aims are. And now he started announcing them again, just clarifying they haven't changed. They're exactly the same as they always were. We've got to get Hamas out, got to get the hostages back, got to have a Palestinian, whatever entity it is in there that has its own independent governance, that is not Hamas, that is not Fatah, that is able to look after Gazans for the sake of Gazans, that will need international forces, probably for an interim stabilization period, set up the education, set up the religious institute, who gets to preach in the mosques, how you keep the Muslim Brotherhood out or very, very much under limits or whatever exactly it is. And that's it. And, they didn't announce that for a long time. Now, having said all of that, Israel, if it had the best PR in the world, it operates in a very, very hostile environment, right? There is a huge part of humanity that is triggered by the word Israel. Israel is the word collective Jew nowadays, and there's a reason why 70% of all United Nations resolutions, whether there's a war or not, will always be condemnations of Israel. There's a reason why the whole world can be suffering wars and famines and everything, and Israel's a year of peace, and 2/3 of all UN resolutions will be condemnations about Israel. Israel doesn't get treated fair. It doesn't get treated the same as anyone else. The founder of Human Rights Watch, towards the end of his life, lamented the fact that his organization has left its entire purpose of human rights to spend its life attacking the West and then super attacking Israel. Yeah, the head of Amnesty International just a few years ago basically called for the dismantling of Israel. The United Nations are populated by people who want the state of Israel destroyed, etc., etc., etc. So it's never going to get a fair hearing. And Western governments, however much they might privately understand Israel, have to deal with the fact that electorally, especially if you're on the political left, you have to be push against Israel. It doesn't matter how just or unjust it is. So I think both those things are true. I think people do have grounds to criticize the fact that Israel has not explained itself well enough, is trying to reverse that now. Probably too late for all the damage not to be done. Should have done so much more strongly, much earlier. It should respond to lies very quickly, and it should be very public and very clear in when it carries out investigations internally. I know there's always tension with the army. Wait till after the war to punish all the people who've done wrong, quietly dismiss them now. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong. That's a very difficult call to make, but I think after the war, they certainly have to be extremely transparent about all these processes and make them very public and so on. So I think Israel gets some of the blame without any question. But I think some of the blame is not Israel's fault at all. It's the mass hysteria of the world. And one more thing I want to say, because this will be true for viewers of yours, if they've managed to watch till now.
Many of them will. We have a lot of devoted viewers.
Fantastic. But this is probably more for the less devoted viewers than the more devoted viewers, I suspect.
Okay.
And that is that the way the human brain is prepped is we operate under groupthink. Solomon Asch showed in the 1970s that if enough people tell you a long line is a short line when you compare lines with each other, most people will at some point go along with the crowd, even though something your own eyes tell you isn't true. So if enough people shriek and howl horrific things about Israel, genocide, 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 sooner or later, the whole political left will fall in line. Sooner or later, politicians and judges and everyone, they're just going to fall in line. Sooner or later, left-wing Jews start falling in line, because humans cannot easily resist the Overton window as things move from the fringe into the mainstream and so on. So, that's why we have to stop and say, 1 second, we know what a genocide is. We know it's killing every single member of a group or every single member of an identifiable subgroup. So in the Holocaust, they tried to kill every single Jew. They killed 95% of Polish Jews. They killed 85% of Lithuanian Jews. They would have killed every single Jew if they could have, right? 63% of Eastern European Jews. We know what the Rwandan genocide was. We know that in 100 days, at least 500,000 Rwandans, 70% of the Tutsi population was killed. And they would have all been killed if their military hadn't managed to stop it. In Srebrenica, where the target was just the Bosniak men, almost all men, like 70% were killed, 8,000 of them in a matter of days. So we know what genocides are. We know anyone with a brain and a working definition can see that Gaza is about the most extreme opposite. 99% of the population is alive. Israel could have killed them all, could still kill them all in a matter of hours. It's so obviously not. But you have to remind yourself of the obvious, because of the howling, shrieking masses impact the human brain. And we start to say, well, I don't know, and maybe, and should I, and should I not go along with it? Because it's now embarrassing if I'm politically left-wing, or it's very embarrassing to say that I don't think it is. They're accusing me of being a denier. There's even academics. Well, of course, academics are the hard left, right? They fell in line right at the beginning. So, these sorts of things, Israel will get extremely unfairly accused. The hostility is going to be gigantic, right? That's the pattern of Jewish history. That doesn't absolve us from looking inwards and trying to hold ourselves to moral standards, but not because of Stockholm syndrome. Don't just like the whole world shrieks at you how evil you are, you start to believe you're evil. That's why having a relationship with God is very helpful. I'm saying this for people religious or not. You have to have a moral authority that's higher than the howling masses of the world. You can't absolve yourself of moral responsibility, right? We cannot absolve ourselves. We have to hold ourselves to that standard. Don't let the world shriek ourselves into letting soldiers die on battlefields and caving in and saying, oh yes, we must be evil because so many people have told us we are, right? So Jewish history teaches us that lesson. Hold yourselves to a high moral standard, and when you've held yourself to that standard, hold your head up high. Let the world shriek whatever. Let the haters shriek whatever they want. There's enough good people out there who understand this as well. But also, there's a responsibility to do our best to explain to others, not because we need their approval, but because we do live in a global world, and where we're doing things that are not wrong, we should be talking to the world, and at least those who are able and willing and want to listen should be able to hear the truth as well.
Absolutely. And that groupthink that you described, that humans are so tempted to want to fit into, I guess that's what makes Abraham all the more remarkable, because he was so prepared to be a thought leader, a revolutionary, and go against the tide. I'm so excited to share with you something that I've been working on for a while. We've just taken JTV content to the next level. Introducing JTV Plus, a new platform streaming exclusive content created and handpicked by me. Get ready for jaw-dropping documentaries, exclusive interviews, insider access, and so much more. JTV Plus brings you captivating stories that will shock and inspire you. Stories that, honestly, I'm discovering for the first time too. From Israel to Jewish history to Judaism, it's all there. In exclusive interviews, you'll hear guests open up about things they've never shared publicly before. Plus, I'll take you behind the scenes where I get a lot more personal with you. By joining JTV Plus, you're not just joining an exclusive community, you're partnering with me to help JTV reach new heights. Just search j-tv.plus and join our exclusive community today. There's a link in the video description. I'll see you there.